conversation. I want to open up the space by saying thank you for coming out tonight. The Booksmith has been around since 1961, and that's because of our wonderful community. Your support means we can keep having events like this, so thank you again. As you may know, tonight's event is part of our ongoing transnational literature series, which focuses on stories of migration, the intersection of politics and literature, and works of translation. If you enjoyed tonight's event, please check out our full events lineup online and at brooklinebooksmith.com. So with some of the amazing authors we have coming up this spring, both virtually and in store. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram for updates. Toward the end of the event, we'll leave about 15 minutes or so for an audience Q&A followed by a signing. We have copies of tonight's featured book available over at the register. And please take a moment to silence your cell phones. I think that takes care of the business end of things, so I'd love to tell you a little bit about our guests. Tonight, I have the very great honor of introducing Jenna Tang and Grace Talusan, here to discuss and celebrate the release of Jenna's new translation of Fang Chi's First Love Paradise by Lin Yihan, the most influential book of Taiwan's Me Too movement and a feminist manifesto across Asia. The novel is a heartbreaking account of sexual violence that explores power and abuse, but also the strength and resilience of women. Insightful and unsettling, it is a staggering work of literature that reverberates across cultures and forces us to confront necessary but painful truths. Jenna Tang is a Taiwanese writer, educator, and translator who translates between Mandarin Chinese, Spanish, French, and English. She received her MFA in creative writing from the New School, and her translations and essays have been published in the Paris Review, Latin American Literature Today, The Margins, Catapult, and McSweeney's, among others. And tonight's moderator, Grace Talusan, teaches in the nonfiction writing program at Brown University. Her memoir, The Bonnie Papers, won the Restless Books Prize for New Immigrant Writing and the Massachusetts Book Award in Nonfiction. She has received support from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Fulbright, U.S. Artists, the Brother Thomas Fund, and the Massachusetts Cultural Council, and residencies such as Mass MoCA, Vermont Studio Center, and Hedgebrook. She is on the board of the National Book Critics Circle. I'm so pleased to have them here together in conversation. And now Jenna and Grace.
Thank you everyone for coming. And I'll start by reading the beginning part of this novel in translation. Part 1, Paradise. Doherty knew the best thing about being a child was that nobody would take her words seriously. She could boast, break her promises, even lie. The things that come out of a child's mouth are often shiny, naked truths. Reacting instinctively out of self-defense, most adults might reassure themselves, what do kids even know? Out of frustration, children learn to tell the truth selectively. This freedom of self-expression is what allows them to grow up. The only time Doherty ever got scolded for something she had said was at a restaurant in a high-rise hotel. These tedious adult gatherings always came with rare, uninteresting delicacies. At this particular meal, a sea cucumber lay on a big porcelain plate like a long turd deep in the toilet that the maid had scrubbed to a brilliant shine. Doherty let the sea cucumber slide in and out of her mouth and then spit it back on her plate. Soon she was giggling audibly. Her mother asked what was so funny. It's a secret, she replied. When the mother raised her voice and asked again, Doherty said, it's like giving a blowjob. Infuriated, her mother made her stand off to the side as punishment. When Fang said she wanted to stand next to her friend, Mama Liu softened her tone and turned to exchange pleasantries with Mama Fang. Doherty knew that compliments like, what a well-mannered child your daughter is, were just empty praise. Their families lived in the same apartment building on the same floor, eating often knocked on the Fang family's door in her pajamas and slippers. And no matter what she had in her hands, be it fast food or workbooks, Mama Fang always welcomed her. They often joked that eating was like a long-lost daughter. The girls could while away a whole night with just a piece of tissue. They were on the cusp of turning into grown adults, but they never had to hide their stuffed animals from each other. They didn't have to pretend that the only games they cared for anymore were poker and chess. Eating and Sichi stood shoulder to shoulder in front of the floor-to-ceiling window. Sichi mouthed, why did you even say that? Eating silently replied, it just sounded smarter than saying it looked like poop. It would take Doherty many years to understand that using a word you barely understood was absolutely criminal. It was like saying I love you to someone you don't love at all. Sichi pursed her lips, gestured at the boats below, and remarked about how many there were. They were about to return to Kaohsiung port. Each of the whale-like cargo ships was led by a tiny shrimp of a boat. Various big and small boats aligned with each other, squeezing out V-shaped waves. The whole of Kaohsiung port resembled a blue blouse being ironed, smoothed over back and forth. The view made them feel sentimental and sad. They were soulmates who shared the infinite beauty of existence with one another. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenna. Is the mic on? Can't tell. Okay, sorry. Okay. Thank you, Jenna, and congratulations on your first book. Yeah. So for those who are coming to this book for newly, could you tell us about the general contours of it, the premise, or maybe we could even just start with the title, and as a way for you to describe what this novel is.
Yeah, so actually in China and Taiwan, there's a hashtag of I'm also Fang, and it's sort of our way of expressing Me Too movement in these places. And the paradise in Chinese is actually 乐园, and 乐园 can be interpreted also as amusement park. Of course, that doesn't go into the English title, but it's working in its own irony that all these fantasies and all these imagined world and literature and everything can be some kind of paradise, but is it really a paradise or not? That's like the answer, or the question is in our head.
Right. So tell us a little bit about the characters we meet and where we find them in the world. Yes.
Yeah, so Fang Siqi and Liu Yiting, they're both living in the same apartment condo, and they're best friends, and they grew up with each other. They both adore this teacher who teaches Chinese literature. In the novel, he's called Li Guohua. And so both of them are sexually groomed, except Fang Siqi was the one that were being assaulted even more across years, while Liu Yiting in the novel being the less attractive one. So all she did was taking the class with the teacher and adored him, and that's pretty much it. There's Li Guohua, the perpetrator, the teacher who teaches Chinese literature in cram school. And there's also this other woman who are Fang Siqi and Liu Yiting's neighbor, Shi Yiwen, who went through domestic violence, and the perpetrator of this domestic violence was Qian Yiwei. Later on, she met this other guy whose name is Mao Jingyuan, nicknamed Mao Mao, who was pretty much observing everything that's going on underground kind of.
Right. Yeah. So we have some of the main characters are these two best friends in Taiwan. They live in the same apartment complex, and they're going to a cram school, and they're also experiencing sexual grooming by teacher Li. Can you tell us, for folks who don't know what cram schools and what sexual grooming is, would you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, great question. So cram school in Taiwan, pretty much it's an after-school program. If we feel like we need to improve math, Chinese, English, or something like that, we go to cram school and take specific programs to improve, to get better grades for college entrance exams especially. So these are the programs that can be really intensive. We finished school maybe at 4 or 5, and then we went there right afterward to take even more tests and have even more assignments just to excel. So that's kind of a system that's very much built in our system, and almost everyone goes to cram school after school. I used to go to cram school for math because my math sucks. And that was part of it. And so the system is so airtight that our world was all about academic excellence, and all that matters were grades and everything. So this is the novel itself is also kind of talking about the educational system in Taiwan, that it's all about studying. In cram school, this airtight space, and some more privileged students, when their parents have money, they were able to hire tutors for them so they can do their other type of after-school program. And the novel itself is talking about that space where it can become dangerous this way.
Right. So you have this kind of system where it's not enough just to go to school. In order to be competitive, you go to this other school, and it seems like you and the author, you're exploring issues about power in these kinds of spaces when people really want something and need something, which is academic success, the hope for future success. And then there's this character of teacher Li. And could you say something about that with the power position he's in around sexual grooming?
Yeah, so part of this book, the central part of this book is talking about sexual grooming, and even though a lot of understanding about sexual grooming is about age gap, but it's not necessarily that. It's more about the unfamiliar and the familiar, the person who's more familiar with things that's going on in the field, who could let the other person on. And so that kind of setting, like it's not just like educational setting. In this case, it's more a teacher and student. But in other cases, like in different walks of life, like it could be someone who's simply in a higher position, having this different power dynamics, who emotionally controlled the other person who's seeking opportunities or who are seeking the things, they just want to follow something that they love.
Right, right. So the setup is there's this educational system, and then there's this power dynamic with the teacher and the students, and then you have this opportunity for someone to take advantage of that and of that power. For folks who don't know the story about this novel and the incredible impact it had in Taiwan, it did, as you said, spark off. There was an important text in the Me Too movement and was influential in that movement. I do want to mention that the author died 3 months after publication of the novel. To honor that author and the work that she did and the really courageous work, she wrote a novel. It's very much a novel, but it is covering experiences that are really difficult, and until that point, until her novel was published, was something that people had not really discussed and put out in the mainstream very much. Could you talk about how you came to the project of translating this novel? To be a translator and to decide what you're going to work on is a tremendous act of faith, and also an enormous use of resources, of your training and time and energy. Tell us about the story of you deciding like this was the novel that you were going to translate from Mandarin into English.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I started translating this novel since 2020, but I first discovered the book the year it was published, so that was 2017. When I was still studying abroad in France, I was taking this train from Lyon to Paris, and I knew my time in France was up. So I was just looking at different catalogs to browse through different books and see what was most popular at the moment. And that was only just 1 month, like several weeks after this book in Mandarin was published. So I took a look and saw a little bit of ebook, and I was like, there's so many places in this novel that actually overlaps with where I used to live when I was growing up in Taiwan. So that kind of brought my attention. And by wanting to translate this book, it was not until 2020 when I took part in translator Brunadanas Lobato's translation workshop, and I started finding project. And this book has always been at the back of my mind because it talks so much about gender in ways that I've never heard back in Taiwan. Like, as much as there are progressive parts from different people in Taiwan, there are also parts that needs more space to grow. And so I feel like the perspective this book was giving me was very special, and I love that it's bringing everything into the language for everyone to discuss, especially about Me Too movement and all these like aggressions and sexual assault, and ways to explore what it's like to talk about this topic. So it just became something that I feel like this is a book I want to translate. It's so important. And then Taiwan started to have different Me Too movement in 2017 and 2023, and so many things have happened along the way, such as the president being the first female president being elected, and then later on we passed policies for same-sex marriage to become legal, and so on and so forth. So just being on this journey, like translating this novel, is also like witnessing so many changes in Taiwan and beyond.
Thank you. Could you talk a little bit about how you think about translation? I think about the words that people use to describe what this novel is exploring in terms of the relationship, the power dynamic and the relationship between the teacher and the student. And there's different ways to write about it or talk about it. You could say relationship, you could say dating, you could say sexual abuse. sexual grooming, all of those mean very, very different things as choices. And in terms of like how I responded to these choices, I wrote about my experience with sexual assault and abuse that happened over 7 years with my grandfather, and some relatives had said to me like, well, oh, he just made a mistake. And like that word does not even come close to describing what I experienced. And I thought about that as I was reading this novel, about the words, how important it is, like how much power there is in the words that we use to describe what is happening, and how it can dismiss and take away from an experience, and how it can support somebody or make them feel reflected accurately and mirrored. So tell us about some of your choices in translating this.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing this to everyone's attention. I really love the question. There are so many intentional choices I try to make, including talking about the author. She unfortunately died by suicide, but I was being very careful when I described. When people asked me about her passing, I said died by suicide instead of committed suicide, because it's not a guilt. So that's one part. And there are other parts where, there's so many parts where I just like really, such as I encourage a lot of my readers to not read it as autobiographical, because it's fiction. And in many ways, like there are different ways of approaching narratives like this with different kinds of sensitivity. And I feel like it's the sensitivity itself that has been really challenging when I was translating it, but at the same time, I'm constantly aware just like how do we approach this in a more careful, and also, it's delicate, but at the same time, like how do we be more respectful?
Yeah. If you don't mind, I'll read a little bit from a sentence that you wrote in your acknowledgments that I think is really important. The process of translation itself is a process of rebirthing a language, of retelling a story over and over for all of us to remember. And there's ways that retelling happens itself in the structure of this novel. Could you talk about what it means, how you've come to understand telling and retelling a story, especially a story of trauma and early adulthood and childhood?
Yeah, something I came to understand while translating literature about trauma is that these narratives aren't always in chronology. Like different titles and like about literature about trauma, a lot of them are being actually like fragmented or involves abstraction and many other ways of shaping the narratives. And sometimes it can look experimental, but these are all like different shapes of trauma. Instead of catering the literary convention, they come out as its different forms and as its own stories. And just during the process, I also came to understanding this and also to respect choices of different authors.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's something about the experience of trauma itself and then trying to relate that I've come across that myself in scholarly work, but also in my own experience of feeling like these really intense traumatic moments, for me to remember them, for me to write about them, they happen in like flashes or fragments. So that said, since we're talking about structure, could you say something about this structure of Milton and like the parts of the book are structured as paradise, paradise lost, paradise regained?
Yeah, so the first part is paradise. It's talking about the friendship that's shared between Fang and Liu Yiting, and it's a lot about their love for translation and languages. And I love how the author and the narrator also focus on saying that she loves translated literature. It was very specific. But the part that's longest in the novel is actually Paradise Lost. Like we spent a lot of time in that part, and of course, like I wasn't able to consult the author like how she like structured the novel exactly. But there's also a part, so we get the beginning part being like very short. It was a foreshadowing of what had already happened to Fang and Liu Yiting. And then we get this huge part without chronology of what may have happened. And was it like when they were 13, 14, and then 17, 18? The timeline just like jumps around, and there's no point of actually following or thinking like, oh, how old are they right now? It's more about their psychology and also their stream of consciousness and how they feel along the way.
Right, because there could be a chronological age, and then there's the age that the consciousness that the narrator is speaking from or telling from. Okay, sorry. So we talked a little bit about how this book was part of the, had an impact on the Me Too movement. There was a book from a few years ago by Shiori Ito, Black Box, the translator is here, and it was a book that was so important in that conversation in Japan about sexual assault. What do you think about the power of books in social movements and as objects, as beginnings of conversations? Like, how do you see books in Asia, but also in particular this book that you've translated as part of that conversation?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I think books are reflections of our era, of our societies. And each book that came out from each year is reflecting the tiny bit of changes or even much bigger changes and movements that's happening in our society. And it goes beyond borders. So like Shiori Ito's memoir that was being translated, I love that book and I love how bold it is. All these books are serving as, they're not just telling their own stories. Like, of course, they're having their language and translation out in the world, but at the same time, they're also in conversation beyond borders. It's talking about all these different structures in different societies, cultures, and how things happen in different like environments and settings. And it's good to, like, during my translation, I read very extensively about narratives about sexual assaults or films about sexual assaults across different cultures and genres in a way to inform like what it's like for me to put this into a language that's English, or how do I put this into my own language?
Yeah. I mean, one of the like most thoughtful emails I've ever gotten inviting me to be in conversation for a book was from you. I mean, I was really moved by what you had to say about your relationship to my book, and I just wanted to thank you. And I don't know, it was really special for me to see what my work, how it might be in conversation with other books. Part of the experience of trauma and assault, I think, is the feeling of aloneness. And so to know that someone has heard you is really, it'll probably be moving to me for the rest of my life, but it is really something to have an experience of such aloneness and separateness, and then to know that you heard it is really important. So thank you for that.
I think your book is also one of the most important memoirs I've ever read.
Thank you. So I was wondering about some of your, like about you as a person, as a writer. You've had these experiences all over the world with multiple languages. What is that like? I mean, tell us where you've lived and the languages that you speak and read in, and what has it meant for you to be living globally?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. It's a fun question for me. I grew up in Taiwan and went to college there, and my major was French, actually. But I told people I divorced French because of the many discriminative things I've experienced when I was studying abroad in France. However, I grew up in my family speaking Hakka, the dialect, and also Taiwanese Hokkien, and Mandarin being the language we use in school. And I started learning English at an early age. It was all about like Taiwanese families saying like, oh, you have to learn English to go to America when you grow up. So I started learning it at a very young age. And in college, I started learning French, and that was my major, partly because I just really loved the wry humor in French, and also in French comedies in general. So I just found myself going into the rabbit hole. And then I studied in Lyon for 1 year as an exchange student, also studying translation. And that was my very first introduction to not just literary translation, but also different kinds of like legal or technical translations. And then during that time, so many of my friends from France were really into exploring nature in Latin America. So that brought me to Spanish. And there were always questions when I learned French or Spanish. They're like, what type of French do you speak? Or what type of Spanish do you speak? So at the time, I decided I wanted to also explore Latin America. And ever since then, I fell in love with it. So right now, I spend every year going to at least one Latin American country. And I just love being immersed in this language, love dancing, and love the food, and love just immersing myself in the language and living in it. And I feel super alive when I'm speaking Spanish. And so I love just living between languages, Spanish, English, and Mandarin. And sometimes like I would wake up when I travel most, like last year, I was all across Latin America. I would wake up and speak a language that I'm not supposed to speak, and people would not understand me. Like around my friends, I would be like, what time is it? And then I would speak in a language they don't understand. But I just love being between places at this moment of my life. And I think it's that love of languages that bring me to so many different stories, not just from Taiwan, but also from different Latin American countries.
So by my count, is that like 5 languages, or maybe it's more that you feel that you're fluent in?
5 languages, but I'm currently learning a new one.
Which one is that?
Korean.
Oh, okay. Amazing. Do you feel different when you're speaking and thinking and writing in different languages?
Very different.
Wow.
When I spoke French, I feel like I am a little more ironic, a little sharper. But when I speak Spanish, I'm more I feel more alive, but at the same time I like to like make fun of people.
It's so incredible to think of, right? Like there's these like untapped parts of our personalities just waiting for like German or some other languages that we may not speak yet. And you're one of the people who's going out and putting effort into learning this.
Yeah, languages are fun. Like I feel like another word I learned or another sentence I learned is just opening up a new world for me. And that makes me happy. And so like I love when people, I used to have this little imagining of myself becoming a spy. So I could...
Maybe you are one now.
Maybe I am. So that I could just like go about, maybe my appearance would give myself away sometimes, but I just like that when people are like, where are you actually from? And I was like, I actually like that you're confused.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like getting away with something big,
Yes.
you know, that to have that, yeah. Incredible. So tell me what, I mean, you have this life in languages and words and books, and there's this line, if you don't mind me reading again,
Of course.
about literature that I'll just read from. And so this is actually part of the novel where the character, and I know you're translating what the character is saying, but I was reading this and thought so much of it. So the character is saying, literature is the most useless thing and the funniest kind of uselessness. I've written so much, and yet I can't save anyone. I can't even save myself. And you know, it's this book that is really a novel that's exploring and celebrating reading and books. And then there's this line there too of this despair as well. And so I guess I was just thinking about like the role that books and reading have played in your life.
Yeah, I feel like that line is also a reflection of sexual grooming from the character's experience in this novel, that she loved literature so much, and the teacher is so well versed in all kinds of Sinophone literature that she felt trapped inside, but she wasn't sure what was going on with her. When I saw literature is useless, I was a little shocked. I was like, it serves so much, and it was basically a part of her life. But I feel like that was probably like the reflection itself. But also, it was her like wanting to speak out. It was her wanting to break out of some kind of box that she said that, like even though it's coming from a lot of despair, but my read was that there was a strength in her that she's trying to get out, but she was struggling.
Yeah, it's this really powerful and interesting position. as the translator, right? Like, because you are making all these choices and there's challenges in conveying things, and language is alive and changing all the time, and there's like so many decisions for you to make. And I wondered if you had specific challenges in this novel with the characters. Like, what's an example of a kind of challenge that you encountered in the translation?
Yeah, it's mostly about bringing the voices of different characters. Like, I would try to imagine, reading from Chinese, I would try to imagine what their voices are like. So a lot of female voices, like Fang Liu Yiting, like the protagonists, I imagine my childhood friends who disappeared when they went through sexual violence, and later on they're just no longer there. So I imagine the voices I remember, and I kind of put it into the novel in translation. And for the abuser's voice and language, I thought about my abusive ex, so I just like went straight into it. And that worked really well, actually. And it was part of me like trying to like break out of my own box.
Yeah. I mean, I was wondering about, I mean, you've written and spoken about why you were drawn to this novel in particular, but it's unfortunate, I mean, to also have a personal relationship or to see yourself personally in the novel as well. And also, unfortunately, very common too, as an experience in encountering and in dating and relationships. What are some of the other ways that you saw yourself in either the authors, or the narrators or the characters?
Yeah, there's so many, like I mentioned earlier, there's so many locations that were mentioned in the novel that are actually places I've been to. The author and I actually went to the same university around the same time, even though we've never met each other. Like, I don't really know her in person, but that overlaps, like, reminds me how small Taiwan is. That any place like she mentioned could be like a Starbucks I know, or another coffee shop that she has been to was like somewhere I used to study very often at. So all these closeness sometimes like became emotionally challenging, because that reminds me of how close these dangers were for me as well, and for many of my friends and people I know.
Yes, and how close danger is, and also how impactful it is. I mean, the cause and effect of the author publishing this book and then 3 months later dying by suicide just makes me think about the power of this book, and the emotional power of it, the courage that it took to write it. It's a novel. I'm not saying that it's her experience, but just the subject matter itself, to approach it, I think, is a very courageous thing to do, but also has an impact. And so for you to walk around and see these places, and to imagine the characters and in those places, it is a really it's upsetting kind of experience.
And very visceral.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm really glad that you read the opening of the book. I mean, it's a very bold opening. Like, once you read those pages and you know this is a book that's not afraid to look at the visceral, for example, or to joke around, and to be very, very direct in that way.
Yeah, there's so many wry humor inside this novel. Like, of course, the themes itself is very serious and very heavy at times, that there are things that we don't really laugh about. But like the beginning part I just read, and also the part, there was one part, there was like a back and forth, very intense conversation between Liu Yiting and Fang Siqi. This is no spoiler. But basically, Fang Siqi was in a very bad mental state, and Liu Yiting was like, are you dating our teacher? Do you want to kill yourself? Can you not jump from our family building? And that part was like, what? What did you just say?
Yeah, so direct.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to leave time and have an opportunity for folks to respond or ask questions. Yes, Allison, go ahead.
So, thank you for this conversation. It's great to hear you both talk about it. Great questions. This question is actually, is it okay? Should I give you a question?
Also, just want to remind everyone that with a sensitive subject matter, we're going to keep all the questions appropriate and sensitive for the group.
Thank you. So this question I think is for both of you, talking about the subject matter and the fact that this is a translation of a novel, so this is fiction, and I know Grace's book is a memoir, and you both teach, so you're both writers and you teach, and so I guess the question is sort of about processing trauma. It doesn't have to be sexual assault, but processing trauma as writers or as teachers working with people who are writing. Is there, we have these options here: fiction, nonfiction, translation. Can you would you speak to, I don't know, how you recommend using writing?
Yeah, there's a certain level of sensitivity I always address in my class to workshop a topic that's more sensitive, that's about trauma, has been really different from workshopping other kinds of stories. So there's always there's several things I would mention is trigger warning, and also the sensitivity where I would consult my students what would you like to get away from the feedback? What are you actually looking for? Is there something we need to be aware that we might not know? There's a lot of preface in creating a safer environment for workshopping. And I always emphasize that before we even start workshopping anyone's pieces. And I feel like those parts and attention are really important in educational setting, in workshops or in literary seminars. I also talk about my own experience translating a novel about trauma and how I approached it, and sort of just hoping that through the translation process, that would reference and refer and would become resources for my students in class as well. What about you, Grace?
Well, I think there's an argument that the past couple of years, whether you've had an experience like in my book or this book, a lot of people have lots of experiences with trauma in the past couple of years. Longer than that too, but so I've noticed that with my students, and instead of going towards directly writing about trauma, I've designed classes that actually go towards joy, pleasure, and wonder. And those stories will come out too, but I just thought, my poor students, we're going through so much, and I think it's a radical thing to also do not ignore what's going on. We have to be responsible and pay attention. And also look at that bird over there, look at that cloud, and take something every day for yourself as a writing practice. And so that's really the direction and ways that I've wanted to take care of my students, was to, of course, write about anything you want, and also turn your attention towards the beauty of every day. Just because of where I've seen them be in the past couple of years. And in terms of me as a writer, I tell them, and I'll tell you, that there's so much power in writing it. You don't have to publish it, you don't have to show it to anybody. There was this exercise that I did in therapy many, many years ago where it's write a letter to somebody and then throw the letter away or burn it or whatever you need to do with it. There is something about the act of writing it. Yes, it's wonderful for it to be received, but it doesn't have to be to have power. You can write something, and that alone is a powerful thing to do, is to externalize it. It's when I'm writing about trauma and things I've noticed, that there's no one to talk to about it, but I can be a witness for myself by putting it on a page, and there is something there to that. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. I read this book when I was in middle school, I remember, and then and I read it in Mandarin as well. So I remember how shocked I was, especially that was my first encounter of reading a book that has mention or has description of sexual assault or this kind of experience that I never experienced in my life. And I really wonder during your translation process, how do you encounter cultural nuance, and how do you connect the gaps between the Mandarin, the Chinese world and the Western world? There are so many times when I, talk to my parents and I do not know how to translate my English thinking back to Chinese. And I think sometimes like when I'm in China, I have the problem of like, how do I translate my English vocabulary back into Chinese? So like, I feel like translation is kind of like a really, really difficult thing, kind of like to make sure that you interpret the original works appropriately and also kind of like connects this book to like a broader audience. So I'm just wondering like, how do you do that and what's your process?
That's a great question. So part of the reason why I kept the Chinese characters as visual effects was that they were more direct. Instead of literally translating the meanings of these characters, like it could just be a characters like pop ups as a sign in some hotels and stores. Might as well just put it on the page so people know what it looks like exactly. So that was part of the intentional choice. And there are many moments where there are things that just have equivalence in English, so I would just put it that. There are also moments where I'm like, because the novel has its own logic, its own ways of narrating the story. And so all these things like, and also Li Yinghan, the author, like when she writes a story, she has her own logic. Like she would refer to so many classical references, like the classical Chinese, and also so many different like sources from international literature, like from Gabriel Garcia Marquez as well. So in those moments, sometimes I would be in conversation with my editor or my mentor, Mike Fu at the time, that, oh, is there an equivalent in this culture? Or is there something, like what's your read in this? So there are a lot of discussions like that for me to bring those nuances in it. And there are times when I bring my draft to my editor or my mentor, and they'll be like, "What do you mean here?" Because part of it is like the author sometimes, like she's so well read in classical and contemporary literature in the Chinese language that she's able to misuse it, or she's able to merge it into the logic of this novel. That sometimes I really need to think twice and understand the original quote, the original classical reference, in order to know how she misuses it or how she intentionally like twists it.
Thank you.
Other folks? A couple more.
Hello. I actually had a question about languages and translation and things like that. And I was wondering if you could speak about languages that, like what do you see as the value in learning like languages that aren't spoken very commonly and things like that? Like languages that are maybe only spoken in one country or aren't spoken globally. And I was wondering what you think about learning those languages, and would you ever learn one yourself, like a language that's more like, you know, vulnerable or something like that? Like what do you think about that kind of stuff?
Do you mean what's my experience learning different languages?
Yeah, like what's your experience learning different languages? Absolutely.
Yeah, so I feel like being able to understand different languages allow me different narratives. So I'm able to read in my case, I'm able to read in Spanish, French, English. So I'm able to observe like different cultural narratives and how they structure different stories or different genres. And through that, sometimes that will inform me like how I can incorporate things I've seen into my translation of literature from different parts of the world. So that's one thing that I really enjoy when I learn different languages. And at the same time, like when I was in Latin America, while this book was in the making, I was reading, I mentioned in one of my articles in Literary Hub that I really enjoyed the Pilar Quintana bookshelf, and that was in the central Bogota bookstore. That she brought so many feminist voices together, like in poems or different genres, and I was just bathing myself in all these narratives, and think about like if there are parts of this novel that I'm translating that I could change, or are there anything that I think somehow flow together, even though they're from different cultures.
This person in blue.
That was lovely. Thank you so much. I wonder, you know, it must be such a responsibility to have this young woman really be such a pioneer. And now you're left with the book, and you must feel such a responsibility in doing her justice, conveying her words and her story, although it's fiction. And I just wonder if you could talk about that, about how you approach that and do honor to her and to your own translation. Thank you.
Yeah, there were many communications that I had with the author's estate. Basically, the author's family, agent and editor who have actually worked with her in person. There are definitely a lot of responsibility involved, mostly about sensitivity or about media questions, because the author's family have been previously like severely harassed by the Taiwanese media, and therefore I do have this mindset where I'm like, I wish people see the book differently instead of poking into the gossip or like learning about the author in harmful ways. But I hope they look at this book differently, like how much it has changed in our conversations and how much it has traveled to different languages and different parts of the world to connect with other narratives. And of course, these changes don't come as easily or quickly, but it's through these little changes that build up to something bigger. And I really hope like people get to see like what this book is doing and what kind of impact it's having.
Yeah, I mean, the comment about being shocked about what's in the book and how direct it is, I mean, it is, sexual assault is actually such a common, unfortunately, common experience. And so, but it shows you like how it's not part of conversation generally in books.
Yeah, totally. Like, there's so many stuff, just talking about sexual violence and also talking about gender topics. There's so much to talk about. And what I love about this book is that it really brings nuances. Like, sexual grooming wasn't a very common term, like, say, 10 years ago. But it really brought our attention to it and to be able to address to it. Many people talk about this book recently because there's a release of Netflix series called Baby Reindeer. It's also talking about sexual grooming. And I also love to encourage people to think about like sexual violence is not just about feminist movement. It's about all genders. Like many people, when it comes to talking about sexual violence, they make it as if it's just something that only happened to biological women. But I feel like the topic itself is actually more expansive. It's more than that. And even though it's not directly mentioned by the book, and I hope by just introducing this book and introducing topics like this, and I will bring the conversation to that part as well.
Yeah, so by naming and exploring it through this novel, people can recognize and have a name and say like, oh, that's what that was, or they'll see it in some other person's life and be able to name it, and that's powerful in and of itself, is to have a name for something, and takes the power away from the abuse that's happening when someone can name it. We have time for a couple more things. Yeah, please. Oh, wait for the.
Yeah, let me come around.
First of all, thank you for sharing your ideas and your work over the years. I was wondering what you thought about her dying, her killing herself at a point after she made such a difficult but very forward-moving book. So, do you have thoughts on that? I mean, you said she killed herself after just 3 months or something, right?
Yeah.
Or is that not?
We're gonna.
You don't want
No. We'll move on. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not the author, and I'm not close to her in that way to know like too much personal details. So,
Yeah. Thank you, though.
Okay, yeah, thank you for the question anyway. Do we have any others?
I could just add to Jenna's bio that she's also on the board of the American Literary Translators Association and does a lot of service towards helping other translators, and so thank you.
thank you so much for having me.
I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, Jenna. What does it mean to you to work with other translators?
It has been a really enjoyable experience for me to be in the Alta community. I love meeting other translators because we're all working across different languages. And it's interesting to hear like what are the challenges translating from one language to another. There are languages, I don't speak every language. So it's interesting to hear like the languages I don't speak and how it's like to address like all these differences. And I love the annual conference that I'm taking part in almost every year since 2020. Ellen has been great to work with. I really love being in the community. To a point, I slowly just find myself getting more involved in different committees and board. It has been such a friendly experience that I find myself not just, I did my MFA program in New York, and I didn't expect until I did my internship at Alta, and all these like friendly translators and communities that actually brought me to where I am today and having my first book in translation. And it was also thanks to the Alta Emerging Translator Mentorship Program where I was able to work on this draft.
It's like finding your community, right? Even though you may all speak lots of different languages, the thing that you have in common is this love for language and the possibilities for storytelling and connection and all of that together. So it sounds great. Nice. Probably
We could do one more if someone had a burning question. No, that's okay. I think that's a lovely place to end it. Thank you so much, Jenna and Grace. This has been amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are going to have a signing. I'm going to have them switch spots, and Jenna will be on that side, and you can come up for a signing. And we have books at the back. Thank you, everyone.